Hi all, I'm Dhruv Sharma and I welcome you all for our next session on ACI integration with VMware. I know there are lots of documentation online and on YouTube which shows how ACI can be integrated with VMware, but I put up this video to mark very clear steps, step by step, which we can follow to achieve our objective. So you can go through these slides from the description link below and follow exact steps to achieve the objective. On that note, let's jump in. We are aware that an appliance can be attached to a leaf, a FTD, like it's a Cisco FTD firewall or any appliance, any networking device can be connected to a leaf within an ACI fabric using three modes. FTD in my example, I'm just giving it as a reference, an FTD or a firewall or a network can connect using an EPG, a bare metal, or using a VMware as a platform, or using a L3 outs when we say it wants to connect through a networking or a routing domain. When we say an EPG, a bare metal, in that case, this is the leaf, and this is a networking device. It can be a router or it can be a firewall that connects to the leaf using a layer 2 mechanism. That's what we are trying to refer it over here. This can be a Cisco FTD firewall. This can be a router as well. But if we want to connect a virtual instance like a FTD which is running in a virtual way, VMware way, so in that case, we're going to use the steps which are shown in this slide, in this PPTs here. And finally, the third way where FTD is trying to set up a layer 3 communication using a routing protocol that we call as L3 outs. So these are the three ways a networking device can connect to the fabric and leverage the benefits. So before we proceed further, so we expect the audience of this video, they have some basic understanding about what are EPGs. So I will not be going into those details. Please leave some comments in my video. If you want a very basic introduction about what are EPGs, I will happy to have a video for you all. But yes, in this video, we are very much concentrating about how a VMware platforms can be integrated with ACI. So in this session, we're going to have a very simple topology, leaf 101, 102, and that is basically is connected to the vSphere, which is hosted on a Cisco UCS server in our lab. The IP address of vSphere is 198.168.133.30. We need this IP address when we do the configuration. So this IP is pretty important. So as I just said earlier, I will not be showing you each and every step. I have already did my configuration, but yes, I will be sure, and I have given some references in this slide where you can go through some YouTube links where they are describing how to implement it. But in this slide, I'm very much focusing on how you can deploy this setting in your environment. So policies, so to integrate the VMware platform, we need to create policies at two tiers. We need to create an access policy, and we need to create a policy at tenant level. First, we will kick on and we'll create policies at the access level. Within access level, we have to create policies for in two areas. If you are coming from a background where you are creating static EPGs, which I mentioned in my previous slide as mode 1, In this mode, if you're creating any integration using mode 1, in that case, you will not have been creating policies under VMware section over here. But since we are creating integrating the VMware platform, we have to create access policies we need to do the configuration, I would rather say, at two areas. One, at the virtual networking level, and second, at the fabric policy level. So first we need to connect to our vSphere client using from your browser, and we need to note down the domain. Or if you're working in your offices, you need to ask a question to your VMware management team to provide you a domain name which is configured on your vSphere settings. You can easily get it, like fortunately it is my lab and I had access to the vSphere client. If you don't have it, you need to ask it. How you can get it? You need to click over here, the networking tab, and finally from here you can basically get the domain name and keep it handy when you're going to configure the settings on the ACI. Log in on the ACI, click this button. It's an automatic button. It will basically automatically create some policies. So I always prefer and I always recommend to go with quick start menu and click this button. The first step is to create a VLAN pool and ensure that we create the dynamic allocation, define the VLAN range, and create new AEP policy unless you have not created it already. And finally, we have to define the credentials which you used to log in as an administrator to log in onto your vSphere server. So you need to ask those credentials. If you're working in an office, you need to ask them and paste it over here. It's a very simple 3-step process. And finally, we need to add the IP address of the vSphere client. If you remember the topology, 198.133.30 and data center name dcloud-dc. So if we go back to my network diagram, 133.30, and I asked you previously, you need to ensure that you remember or you copy it down the domain name, because it will going to come handy when you going to configure it. And as I said, here we are. So we need to provide that configuration over here. That's the 4th step. And the 5th step is to configure MAC pinning. In my case, I'm using VPC to configure, to attach both, my topology. These are the leaf switches. If you remember on my slide, and this is the UCA or UCS server, or I would say the VMware server, which we're trying to integrate, and we are using VPC. So remember, most of the time we have to use MAC pinning because VMware, they don't have LACP enabled on them. So we need to enable port channel mode as MAC pinning. And you can basically refer back to, in your office, you can go back to your VMware team and confirm that MAC pinning plus is supported. And that would be the final output. Before we proceed further, I will give you a quick demo about how it's been there and how I already did it when I basically configured it in my lab. So this is a summary, and you just have to follow exact 5 steps to achieve the objective. So the best part, I feel about, how ACI is so much gelled up together with the VMware platform. We create a domain name over here, the virtual switch name over here. It will automatically create this domain name back into the VMware server. So you don't need to create it, and it will automatically sync together. The gelling is so beautiful, I would say, that it works very well. So before we proceed further with any further steps, let's show how it is there on the live device. We'll quickly log in. Okay, so I'm here with my VMware setting under the VMware network settings and VMware domains and VMware. So this is the VMware. The name could be different because in my PPT, I created it some time back and I just recreated it for you, but the policy name and all those stuff should remain same. As you can see it right now, I created an AEP, which I showed it in my slide. We created VLAN pool. This pool will be used to define and map it to the right VLANs, those virtual machines. So in a nutshell, we are basically configuring the setting which will be pushed from the ACI back to the VMware server. So that's the beauty of it. I feel, there have been lots of questions around, what was the need of ACI when Nexus 7K switches were working so perfectly well. So I believe the intentions of ACI was to integrate with the cloud and virtual platforms more. So it was not produced to integrate it with the regular firewalls or the networking devices. The mindset of Cisco must be, it's my understanding, uh, it must be, they introduced it. They must have introduced it so that it can gel up with the VMware servers or the virtual servers, which was missing with Nexus 7K. And as I showed you on the slide, I also created the credentials which I used to log in on the VMware server. And finally, the IP address, which matched to my topology. This is the IP address which we used to log in on the server. So, but you can see that as soon as I did my setting, the domain Dhruv vCenter is immediately getting reflected in the D cloud. I didn't created it, it's automatically pumped up. So that's the beauty, right? Let's proceed further. So next step, the part B. So if you remember, we discussed the access policies needs to be configured at 2 levels. We completed the policies at the virtual networking level, where we basically define the domains and the credentials, how an ACI can connect back to the VMware server. And so far from the configuration, it looks like the connectivity is there, so which is good news. But now we need to configure the access policy at the fabric level. Why we are doing it? Because as I showed you earlier in my topology, we had 2 leaf switches which are configured as a VPC to the main server. So to configure the actual VPCs between these leaf 1 and leaf 2 towards that VM server needs to happen through fabric policy. On that note, let's jump in. So to create a VPC, first we need to create the VPC interface policies. So in my case, I have used these configuration. So go under fabric policies, access policies, and there go into VPC interface setting and define this configuration. So in my case, I have defined the link level as 10 Gbps and port channel. LACP active, these two are mandatory, to ensure that the LACP is configured at the leaf level. To avoid any confusion, if you remember, on my previous slide, I showed you when we were doing some access policy configuration for the VMware servers, we define MAC pinning at LACP level. I am happy to go back and show you over here, as you can see, port channel. But in our case, at the this configuration of access policy is for the leaf switches. So that's why we have defined LACP, not MAC pinning, because our our ACI switches, they can understand LACP. Then create a new interface profile. So the steps are fabric policies, access control policy, and the profiles, and define the interface. If you remember my topology, I've used interface 1/1 on both switches to connect to the VMware server. So I've selected, that's the third step which we need to follow. And and finally, you just have to go into the switches domain and create a LACP profile to create LACP, and that stuff will be achieved. So how we can do it? I can let's show it in a quick lab. We go into AP controller, fabric policies, access control policies, switches, leaf, profiles, and under the profile we can see LACP is, or VPCs are configured, and this is a switch profile which are added. How you can create it is pretty simple. You just have to create configure interface, and from here you can just click sign, and you can add those interfaces. So I already have done it, and how you can achieve, how you do configure VPCs. If you want me to set up a new video, I leave your point in the comment section. I'm happy to show it to you how we can create VPCs, but there are already lots of videos on YouTube which shows how to achieve it. And under the profile section, I have shown it how the interface profiles are mapped. So this is the same interface which connects to the UCS VMware server. The same steps are identified in my slides. UCS VMware. So it is basically recalling the interface policy group. So once that is achieved, we can basically log in into the vSphere client, and we can see basically all these stuffs we are doing at the background is automatically being pumped up into the vSphere client. So it's basically shows how well these two platforms are integrated together. Now, since it is integrated, if we log in into our VMware virtual networking section, by now, you should be able to see all these VMware servers interfaces which are getting popped up. Finally, we will create the tenant-based policy. If you are already aware why we need a tenant-based policy, so we already have created earlier uh, access control policies at both switch level and at the VMware level, but those policies needs to be applied to the real switches that happen at the tenant-based level. So you just have to follow very simple steps to achieve this, and you can easily get to your objective. Step number 1, create an application profile. Right-click application profile, give it a name, and map it to a appropriate bridge domain. Connect the EPG to a VMware server. I mean, you need to map it to a VMware domain. In my case, if you could remember, it was Dhruv, my vCenter. And the last step, we are already reached very close to our objective. We need to define the contracts, because if we have multiple EPGs, multiple servers in my lab environment, we created a VMware instance using uh, we call it 20, 21, and 22, which is a web server, an app on a web server, and the database. This is a simulation, but obviously in your environment, it could be a commercial app, and there could be an e-commerce website, and it could be an SQL database. So all these servers can be mapped, and if you want a web application to talk to an web server to talk to an application server, and the application server to talk to the database, we need to create these contracts. So this basically, these three simple steps which we can follow, we can basically get to our objective, and same how I have achieved in my lab. I'm happy to give you a quick demo about how we have achieved it. We get back to the tenant, we go back to the tenant Dhruv, and under the application profiles, I created my app. And under the my app application, I created 2021. So I left one for the quick demo, so which I can show it to you how we basically created. If I log back to my VMware center, you can see as I created that application, it automatically pops up into the vSphere client. I didn't have to manually create it. It creates automatically and looks perfectly fine. And I already mapped these two virtual instances to my environment. You can ask your VMware administrator to do it, but it's very simple. You just need to click Add Manage Host, click Next. So since I've already added it, you just need to select a couple of boxes and click Next. And finally, those servers will be added over here. Going back to my configuration at ACI, before we do further changes, let me give you a quick demo about how the configuration looks like in VMware. As I told you, the settings are very closely integrated together. As you can see, app 20, Dhruv, my app, and 20. So Dhruv is a tenant, my app is an application, and 20 is the EPGs we have created. So it basically sync up. Not only we pushed that configuration from the tenant and from the tenant policy into the ACF app, into the VMware platform, and the VMware platform synced up with this virtual networking environment. So it's beautifully synced up, as you can see. It talks about all those stuffs. You don't, as a VMware administrator, you don't need to log into those servers, and you can fetch most of the information from here. If you saw this VEXX server, which we added from the vSphere client, by clicking add host, those automatically they popped up into here, and you can see what servers you are basically managing it from the APIC, or I would say not managing it, what servers basically connects to the ACI fabric. It's beautifully integrated together, and you can basically get a good idea about how the servers are integrated. And network administrator is not now is he's not really dependent on the on VMware platform team to provide most of the details. And all the VMware network adapters, all these configurations, whether they are up or not, you can basically check it from here. If there is a network issue and some VMware servers are not working, so you can just go back to here and see, and you can inform the network or the VMware server team that it looks like there is some problem at your network adapter and it isn't up. So all those configurations, you can basically check it over here. So I find it remarkably awesome. It's amazing when you see how the integration happen. When we get back to the tenant setting, I left this piece for just for the demo. If we right now we created the application EPGs for 2021. Let's give you a quick demo how I did it. If I just create a new EPG and map it to 22, click OK, click Submit, bring up the VMware server. We can do it at various level. So showing it through GUI or those is pretty easy. This topology at the canvas setting over here is amazing. We can basically see what's happening on through that canvas setting. Its visualization is pretty awesome. Otherwise, you can basically add those configuration from here as well. But surprisingly, you will see that when we add the configuration from here, it gives us a lot more options, which it didn't provided us when we added it from the canvas. And finally, let me just maximize it. If I say that right now, if my app wants to talk to my database, in that case, you have to provide a contract. Let's call it DB2. DB database is trying to communicate to the app. So it's all depends on the requirement, which server is trying to communicate with which server, and you can easily achieve it using the contract. And if we go back to the VMware server, you can see this immediately pops up. So Dhruv is a tenant. My app is the application what we defined, application profile, and 22, 20, and 20, they are EPGs, as you can see over here. Within a second, it's basically popped up and started reflecting over here. That's the beauty about how ACI is integrated, guys. So I'm in a very I'm in a really favor. If you are deploying a solution on a cloud, so definitely ACI is a go-ahead thing where you can integrate your solution very cleanly and properly, and the network administrator guys can fetch and get most of the information from the ACF fabric itself. And similarly, it's an advantage for the VMware team as well. The VMware team has an visibility about how ACI is configured, right? So it's not just the network guy. A VMware guy is also aware of how ACI is configured, because from this setting, he can basically come back to you, say that there is a tenant Dhruv and an application, my app, and 20, the EPG isn't working well. So he can, I think the visibility to and fro is far better on that case. Before we wrap up, I will going to pick up a couple of questions which I basically found like on guys have asked me over the LinkedIn or maybe contacted over the forums. Quick questions. If you log in on the leaf switches, you will see they see an option of there are lots of interfaces are configured with the status of out of service. What does it imply? It just implies that the interface is not configured with any policy. So it's the name is little different. And once the policy is pushed to those interfaces, then the status change from out of service to none. That's a famous, it's not exactly the famous, it's been a popular question around. So when you go and connect to a leaf switch and run a command show interface brief, you will see such kind of an option. And out of service is just you haven't configured any policies on the interface. Once you will push it, it has to be changed to none. I know none. None doesn't mean that no policy is configured on it. It just none means no errors. What modes connecting to you can connect from APIC, into the leaf. There are two ways using a config terminal mode and the bash mode. Config terminal is like classic NXOS configuration. Another is the bash mode. From the APIC, I can connect to the leaf using this command attach leaf 101. And if you even just type from the APIC leaf 101, you can basically view the configuration of a certain leaf. The references, as I mentioned, lots of videos are there on your YouTube. One I have already mentioned over here in my references as well. So it shows you how to configure it, how to configure this VMware server. It's been number of steps, but this slide over here, it defines very exact 5-step and 3-step process to achieve your objective. And there is a Cisco documentation, which in this references, you can go through it to get a better idea how to achieve and how to configure uh, VMware integration with the ACI fabric. I hope this session was informative, and I thank you for joining.